Welcome to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. Exactly 60 years ago today, the 2nd of July 1966, the Beatles played their final two shows of the first and the only Japan tour at the National Judo Arena, or better known as the Nippon Budokan, the first music act ever to play there. The band stayed in Japan for a grand total of 4 days. But, mind you, they crammed in 5 shows across those 3 days. They were here for 3 days, more or less. And that sounds borderline psychotic by today's standards, until you learn that each show lasted about half an hour. In, out, bow, and leave. Practically a changing of the guard. And yet, the cultural impact they left on Japan is immeasurable, to say the least. And before you say anything, I know there are far too many videos about the Beatles out there already. Pretty much every story about them has been told. Anything from what sort of food, drinks, cigarettes and substances they preferred to how the band members group wanked together. Yet, here I am, foolish enough to have a go at telling the Beatles story from the Japanese perspective. How the visit happened, what it meant to Japanese people, especially the young, and how it changed the cultural landscape of the country forever. When I was at school in Japan, every classroom had a chronological table on the wall in the classroom. I believe they have the same thing even today, well, except the tail end of it is a bit longer. Walk into any history museum of any sort and you'll find the table, the defining events of each year. For example, 1945, the end of the Second World War, obviously. 1989, the demise of Emperor Hirohito and the end of Showa era. 2011, the Tohoku earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster. All are events of considerable historic significance. In the 1966 column, it invariably says one thing: the Beatles visit Japan. That was conceived and agreed by all historians as the single greatest historic event of that year. In the UK, the Beatlemania broke out in 1963. In the US, it was 1964, the year of the Ed Sullivan Show. However, in Japan, it was 1966. Exactly 900 years after the Normans conquered England, the Beatles conquered Japan. When I hear the surname Epstein, it means one person and one person only to me. Brian Epstein, the legendary manager of the Beatles, not Jeffrey. Even George Martin, the band's producer, recalled that Brian wasn't the sharpest negotiator when money was on the table, and that he often settled for deals well beneath what the world's most famous entertainer might have commanded. If you've watched Peter Jackson's Get Back, you remember Brian's eventual successor, Alan Klein. If you ask me, Klein did considerably more to break up the Beatles than Yoko ever did. That's if she was ever responsible for any of it at all. As I understand it, John Lennon was needling about how the Beatles were outselling the Rolling Stones by millions and yet somehow taking home less money. And that, by one account, is the resentment that opened the door to Klein in the first place, the Stones' own manager at the time. Whilst it is true that Alan Klein eventually clothed the Beatles at far better royalty rates, I also believe that if Klein was managing the Beatles in 1966, they would have never performed in Japan. At least that's what I think. Japan at the time was still in the transition period between developing and the developed country, with a developing music market which eventually matured to become the second largest and lucrative one after the US by the late 70s. But this was still mid-60s, so the market wasn't quite so mature yet. However, even from London, Brian Epstein was well aware that the Japanese music industry was growing dramatically in the mid-60s and plenty of business opportunities awaited for the band. So Brian negotiated with a gentleman named Tatsuji Tats Nagoshima, a Kyoto agency promoter who was brought up in the UK and the US during pre-war era, educated privately, one assumes, and consequently spoke English like the Queen, according to some sources, whatever that means. Standing well over 6 foot tall, he went on to bring acts like Led Zeppelin, Stevie Wonder, Elton John and Michael Jackson to Japan. By all accounts, a thoroughly decent man. Very sophisticated gentleman. So Tatsu Nakashima won the trust and became a good friend of Paul McCartney. He allegedly was the only Japanese person invited to Linda McCartney's memorial service in 1998. Well, so apparently Yoko wasn't invited. The road to bringing the Beatles to Tokyo was paved with intense coordination, handled primarily by Tatsu Nagashima, alongside key allies like Rumiko Hoshika, a young editor-in-chief of Music Life magazine, who had famously secured an exclusive interview with the Beatles in London in 1965 by bribing Brian Epstein, who happened to be a devoted fan of Kurosawa films, with a real samurai sword which she smuggled from Japan as a hand luggage. Well, different time, different security. Rumiko is a fascinating figure. She happened to be on the ground floor of the Apple building while the band performed their legendary last gig on the rooftop. So hopefully I'll cover her in this podcast at some point, because she's quite a character and there's so many amazing stories about how she got to eventually conduct an exclusive interview with the Beatles at the peak of their fame. Epstein and Nagashima settled on a fee of $100,000 per show, equivalent of roughly $1 million today, adjusted for inflation, which is a lot of money for a music act in pre-bubble Japan, but relatively modest fee given the sheer physical toll of travelling halfway across the world to perform only 5 shows. And don't forget, the Beatles at the time were the most sought-after entertainer in the world. Another crucial aspect of the whole thing is the ticket pricing. Japanese booking agents initially estimated that devoted fans would willingly pay up to 10,000 yen per ticket for premium seats to offset the massive production and security costs. That sounds almost cheap today, but in 1966, it represented a quarter to a third of an average monthly salary, and considerably more than half of what a young person might earn per month. Which, come to think of it, isn't wildly different from what people are willing to cough up for Bruno Mars or Taylor Swift today. And yet, to keep the shows accessible to the band's actual fan base, mostly teenagers, not merchant bankers, the organisers went with startlingly modest standardised pricing instead. So the premium seats were 2,100 yen, roughly the price of a standard LP at the time. Mid-tier seats 1,800 yen, and general seats were 1,500 yen. Now, I have a very difficult time imagining a cutthroat business operator like Alan Klein agreeing to any of this. The Beatles could clearly have charged a great deal more. It might have shut out the younger fans, but money's money. I'm sure that's how these businessmen's minds work. For Brian Epstein, however, the brief Japan tour wasn't just about a quick cash payout. It was a high-profile, long-term promotional campaign designed to permanently encore the Beatles in Japan, supercharge vinyl album sales, and establish a dominant foothold in a massive consumer economy that was clearly on the rise. Alan Klein famously described Brian Epstein's gentlemanly, old-school approach to deals and contracts as laughable, amateurish, and disastrous. Actually, the more I think about this guy, Alan Klein, ruthless, aggressive, and above all, allergic to a fair deal, the more he reminds me of a certain political figure currently rattling the world. But I won't go down that particular rabbit hole today. For what it's worth, I rate Brian Epstein the superior manager to Klein, because despite the modest pricing and the modest guarantee, the Japan tour proved enormously profitable in the long run, more than profitable in fact, transformative. I seriously doubt the name of the Beatles would have appeared on the wall of every classroom in Japan had more, shall we say, ruthless business person like Alan Klein managed the Beatles at the time. Another important aspect is the list of people who either went to the Budokan or saw the Beatles live on TV at the time, had an epiphany and went on to change the landscape of Japanese music and culture. It is remarkable. Let me name a few. Eikichi Yazawa, sometimes called the Japanese Mick Jagger. Keisuke Kuwata, who went on to front the Southern All-Stars, one of Japan's best-selling bands of all time. Tatsuro Yamashita, the king of city pop. Eiichi Otaki and Yosu Inoue, two of the most important legendary figures in post-war Japanese pop. And the list goes on indefinitely. And then there's Ken Shimura, the legendary comedian who sadly passed away in 2020 from COVID. Rest in peace. You may know him from the comedy sketch where he plays an English teacher hopelessly mangling a Japanese classroom full of foreign students. It went viral on social media a few years ago. As a teenager, Shimura idolized the Beatles to the point of adopting the mop-top haircut, and by sheer good fortune, his band, the Drifters, which he later joined, were actually on the bill that night. They were opening for the Beatles at the Budokan. He always said that the experience shaped him as an entertainer and that his comedy would have looked entirely different without the experience. You wouldn't necessarily put the Beatles and Japanese slapstick legend in the same sentence, but there it is. And one more honorable mention. Haruki Murakami, one of the most celebrated novelists in the world today. The guy named his books Norwegian Wood and Drive My Car, for God's sake. Actually, he must have a weak spot for Rubber Soul. Those two songs are from the album Rubber Soul, right? So let me guess what the title of his next novel would be. In My Life? Or Michelle? Or Nowhere Man? Actually, come to think of it, Nowhere Man does have a ring to it. It does sound a bit like the possible title of Murakami's next novel, Nowhere Man. Japanese people are often described as apolitical, especially the young ones. But it wasn't always so. There were substantial student movements through the late 60s and the early 70s. And I'd wager the Beatles, John Lennon in particular, had a lot to do with stirring the pot and being their inspiration alongside Che Guevara. Unlike Elvis or Michael Jackson, the Beatles made an anti-establishment, progressive attitude look cool, especially if you're in a band in Japan or anywhere else. To this day, it's considered deeply uncool and naff for a rock musician to hold conservative views, unless you're one of those acts who doesn't like your own songs. That being said, there are notable exceptions, but I don't wish to endorse any of them here, so I shall refrain from dropping their names. And I shall also happily, and I mean happily, confess that, had I not been initiated by the Beatles at the tender age of 14, I doubt I'd have gone astray in my career and end up doing what I'm doing now. In fact, I doubt I would have even ended up in the UK at all. Without the Beatles, I suspect, in fact, I am convinced that I would have become a monolingual, law-abiding Japanese salaryman with an agreeable haircut, a perfectly respectable member of the society who would grumble about the LDP government over izakaya beers, voting for them anyway because the alternatives never quite convinced, and living an entirely normal suburban life. Shame, really. Such is the magnitude of the impact the Beatles had on me personally and on myriad of other Japanese young people of that and later generations. And the Beatles might have never reached that mythological status in Japan had they not visited here in 1966. And before I wrap up, let me make one thing clear. The point of this episode is not to discredit Alan Klein or diss him, especially since he's no longer with us. The point, rather, is this. If you chase the quick money too aggressively, particularly with art, like a true fundamentalist capitalist, you often compromise the art itself and the culture that nurtures it, and you might even lose money in the long run. So the moral of the story is, no culture without economy, and no economy without culture. On that note, this has been Post Whatever. If you found any of that remotely useful, which I strongly doubt, or at least mildly diverting, which remains a distant possibility, do consider liking and subscribing. Believe me, it really helps. I will have to take a break next week to concentrate on the music composition and production work for this art project that I mentioned before. It's coming along and some of the tracks are sounding really good, I think, and I'll be bragging about it very soon here. I'm Ken Nishikawa. Until next time, remember, the love you take is equal to the love you make.